Talk. This week, we're going to be talking with John Fleck, who's at the University of New Mexico, who I'm certain many of our listeners already know, and Kathryn Sorenson, who is a colleague of mine at ASU. And John and Kathryn are actually longtime collaborators, and I'm really excited to learn from their expertise and delve into a more, holistic view of the Colorado River, not quite so focused on the California side, but really on sort of the entire Colorado River system all the way to Mexico. So Malika, Sam, what are you guys looking forward to today?
Yeah, I'm just really excited to kind of continue the conversation that we started last week about compacts and to kind of have this comparative frame, right? Like one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the Great Lakes Compact that we talked about last week. That compact was formed in 2008, right? So that's pretty recent. So when we had that conversation with Professor Salim, like he was mentioning a lot about like how the science was actually pretty good that went into it at that point, and we were talking, I think when we were talking about it, we were thinking about just some of the issues around allocation and just the amounts and how that compared to what we're going to talk about today, which is the Colorado River Compact, which is 1922. So over 100 years ago. And if you think about just how the science of water has changed, Sam, I know you call yourself as a scientist a water accountant. I think that the science of water accounting has changed a lot over the last 100 years. And just even our concept of climate change and all of this stuff is really different and interesting to think about.
Yeah, similar here. I'm really excited about talking with John Fleck and Kathryn Sorenson. A huge admirer of both of them and their work. I do agree. I think that I really like that both of them, they always, when they are talking, they talk about the 9 states. So the 7 states plus the two in Mexico, and then the other one that they are now thinking it, which is the First Nations, a long conversation. I also think that as going in this bigger scale, I'm really glad that we're talking with two people that know the Colorado River locally, that knows the ins and outs, that actually have been in the place, and that more than criticizing and pointing out some of these deficiencies, as I was talking, that the Colorado River is overallocated, they are proposing ways to move forward. And I think that is extremely important. And the work that they are doing on the post 2026 document of the Colorado River and the 9 states, I think that is an interesting document that not only highlights the shortfalls, but how to move forward. And the reality is that as all of us, we are thinking climate change is here. Like, don't we don't have to wait, it is already here. And they are calling for being a more responsible, that the 9 states and including the First Nations to be more responsible in terms of acknowledging that there is not enough water there, and how we're going to reduce our water use. And those are really difficult conversations for everyone, because no one wants to leave a drop of water in the table.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting spot to get into the conversation, because Malika started talking about sort of the history of the Colorado River Compact, and Sam sort of ended on the note of where are we headed with all of this. And certainly the politics on the Colorado River are evolving and changing every day. There's been some really interesting changes in terms of the way the upper basin and the lower basin are collaborating and coming together in very different ways than they were even a short time ago. So let's go ahead and get into our conversation with John and Kathryn. Welcome to Water Talk. For today's episode, we're talking with two of the foremost experts on the Colorado River. John Fleck is a longtime Western journalist turned academic at the University of New Mexico. John is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Water is for Fighting Over and Other Myths About Water in the West, and co-authored Science Be Damned, How Ignoring Inconvenient Science Drained the Colorado River with Eric Kuhn. Dr. Kathryn Sorenson is the Director of Research for the Kyle Center for Water Policy and a professor of practice at Arizona State University. Kathryn is trained in ag and resource economics, and while currently in academics, she spent much of her career as a practitioner, including as the Director of Phoenix Water Services. Welcome, John and Kathryn. We're so happy to have you on Water Talk.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, super excited.
Awesome. Thank you. So just to start, I've given pretty bare bones intros for both of you, given your very hard-earned expertise and years at this. So we would love to hear more about your backgrounds and kind of what led you to where you are today. So let's start with you, Kathryn.
Wow. Yeah. What led me here? I'm from Arizona. So I think growing up, I just understood how important water was. As a senior in high school, I took a course in economics, and I just fell in love and knew I would be an economist. And for me, it was pretty easy to connect water and economics. I studied the economics of water as an undergraduate and then, of course, in graduate school, and made it my dissertation. And I really lived in this world ever since. Never looked back, loved every second.
And how about you, John? Can you talk just a little bit about your background and where you are now?
So I spent much of my life as a newspaper journalist. And when I was working originally in Southern California, I was covering a municipal government, city of Pasadena. And the city government had a water department. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Wonder where all the water comes from. And one of the things that I realized right away as I tried to understand and explain Pasadena's water is that thinking about water is a way to start thinking about a community as a whole, because one of the first things communities have to do to be a community is solve the collective action problems around water. And so as a journalist trying to understand communities, I realized I can always start with the water. And a career that spent I spent most of my life in New Mexico, but water was always in the background as a thing that I wanted to write about. And then this connects up to the story of how Kathryn and I got to know one another, because I was writing for newspapers and I was also blogging, a very active blogger, because what I know how to do, I just have my words and I write in public. That's a characteristic of academics, but also journalists. And I was writing this blog, and one day I was at the Water Resources program at the university, and there's a little sticky note on my door when I came in that someone named Kathryn Sorenson had called the Water Resources program and wanted to talk to me. And I'd written something about water in Phoenix, and Kathryn had called and tracked me down. And that was the start of a long and fast friendship, as Kathryn helped me understand Arizona water, the Colorado River, but also the challenges of being a municipal water manager and keeping the taps flowing for a city of 1.5 million people, which is just a fascinating challenge.
So I'm going to switch into the nominally the main topic of our conversation today, which is the Colorado River. Obviously, it's hard to jump in with a single episode, but I know, John, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, obviously, written a couple books about it. So could you talk to us maybe about, I don't even know if this is the right number, sort of like the top 3 events that led us into kind of where we are in the Colorado River Basin these days?
Yeah, so it's actually a really great question, and I'm going to be fuzzy about how we define event, right? But one of the things that interests me in my work, which is an underlying motivation for both the books that I've written, Waters for Fighting Over and Science Be Damned, is the evolution of the policies, the evolution of the rule sets, what the Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom would call institutions. By institutions, we don't mean government agencies. We're talking about the rules that we make as communities to govern our shared use of a resource, and then how we make those rules, and then how those rules change and evolve over time in response to changing communities and community values and changing resources. And there's really sort of 3, I think, events, and I'll be fuzzy about what we mean by an event here. But in the 1920s, we did 2 things, and I'm going to call them a single event. And it was the negotiation of the Colorado River Compact in 1922, which was 7 U.S. states coming together to try to negotiate a sharing agreement around the Colorado River. It was a year of negotiations, a very difficult and complex process to lay out a sort of foundational set of rules that we all could agree on. And then a period of 6 years that followed that culminated in action by Congress to authorize the Boulder Canyon Project Act. And those two things collectively became the sort of foundational rules that needed to exist before we could have government agencies do things, build stuff, dams, canals, to do things that sort of fundamentally changed the landscape of the Western United States. And it's fascinating in studying and writing about the history of this to think about the fact nobody had ever really thought at this scale before, trying to manage a large river at the scale of an entire basin, because we didn't have the capability to act at that scale. We wrote the rules, and then they didn't work very well, as often happens with this rule writing process. And they culminated in sort of the second event, which was a really important lawsuit filed by the state of Arizona against the state of California. But it really invoked much larger questions about how the rules worked. And this came about because we were unable to come to agreement among ourselves about how to change the rules. And we handed the responsibility off to the courts, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Arizona versus California, Supreme Court decision in the early 1960s, which in many ways was, a terrible, ham-handed, frustrating decision that caused us decades of problems going forward. Because we couldn't work it out ourselves, we asked somebody else to write rules for us. They didn't do a great job. And then the third event is a very personal one for me. It was in the spring of 2022. And I was actually on a bike ride out of Moab in Colorado down the old Potash Mine Road. It's a paved road that follows the Colorado River. Long day by myself on vacation before I headed into a water conference. And this is the place where the Colorado River enters the canyon country before it's heading into Glen Canyon Dam in Powell. And just as I was about to lose cell service, I got a text from a friend of mine who had been in the operating room at Glen Canyon Dam when the elevation of Lake Powell dropped below elevation 3,525 feet above sea level. And that was sort of a marker for all of us. That was a level that we thought we would never have to go below. And it was a realization that the rules were failing us. And so it's sort of three events that I've laid out here, rules that have been enormously successful in many ways. We've built the West, but ultimately have not proven adaptable enough to deal with the modern realities of climate change.
So I'm gonna add to that with maybe a slightly different take. I'm going to add that in 1944, the United States entered into a treaty with Mexico for the delivery of 1.5 million acre feet of water from the Colorado River to Mexico. And we talk a lot about priorities in the Colorado River, who has the highest, who has the lowest, who gets cut in terms of shortage and all of those things. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that because this is an international treaty, Mexico actually has the highest priority on the river system. And one of the issues with that treaty is that it did not really detail or account for the fact that there are evaporative losses from the Colorado River system, and it assigns none of those losses to the Republic of Mexico. And so that was, I think, also a major kind of issue or point in time that got us to where we are today. I would also add in 1968, as I like to say, a year of both celebration and infamy for the state of Arizona, the Arizona successfully managed to get federal authorization to build the Central Arizona Project Canal, which is the canal that imports Colorado River water from the main stem in western Arizona into central Arizona, into the Phoenix, Tucson urban corridor. So for that reason, there was celebration, but it was also a day of infamy for us because the price that California extracted from Arizona in Congress was that the water imported through that canal would be cut first in times of shortage before the Colorado River water that California and Western Arizona uses is cut in times of shortage. And what that has meant is that tribes, cities, power companies, mining companies in central Arizona have Colorado River water access, but it's lower in priority than pretty much everyone else in the system. And so I think that's also a really big marker in terms of what got us here where we are today. But then my third thing is what you might call mega drought or aridification. So we know that over the last 20 odd years, we have experienced not just a drought, but basically the worst drought in the last 1,200 years, according to the people who measure these things with tree rings. So it's not just a drought, it's a super, super bad drought. And scientists are telling us that the whole river basin is just drying up, right? It's aridifying. And so it's one thing to combat a drought that, reservoirs are built for that purpose. They store water when there's, years of lots of snowpack and precipitation, and then you drain those reservoirs during dry years. The reservoir's work is operated. We've just been handed this really, really difficult 20-year period by Mother Nature, and no one knows if it's going to be another 20 years, another 2, or another 100.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear the sort of differences in your answers. And I think that probably is a more robust accounting of things. And what really struck me, honestly, John, was in the beginning when you said that, nothing like that had been sort of tried at that scale before. And just thinking about the fact that Arizona had just become a state, honestly, in 1922, right? Arizona, I think, became a state in 1912, if I have my 8th grade Arizona history right. So, to have that kind of, I guess, that large scale agreement set up, or that compact set up so early in the history, really, of the entire Western United States is really kind of a sobering fact to think about.
Yeah, and it should be not surprising that the rules didn't quite work. Like, how could you possibly think this far in the future, and how could we possibly have written rules? Because Kathryn's absolutely right. The climate that has now been handed us, Eric Kuhn, a mutual friend of Kathryn's and mine, likes to say that those were rules that were written for a different river, and how we adapt to that change is crucial.
But I also want to say, in support of the rules, I do fundamentally agree with John. But the rules have been surprisingly successful in that here we are, there are still 7 states, there's still the Republic of Mexico. This river is still able to support massive amounts of agriculture, industry, all of these disparate uses. We're definitely at a point of real difficulty, and it will be interesting to see how the rules are changed to deal with that. But I think it's super important to understand that whole economies are built on these rules. And so there are a lot of people out there who will say things like, well, let's get rid of prior appropriation, or, let's throw things out wholesale. I just don't think they understand exactly what that really entails. Certainly change is necessary in the Colorado River Basin, but we need to be careful about understanding what those types of wholesale changes might really entail. And I think John would agree with that, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you both for that. And I guess just, jumping a little bit from the history, so to speak, and into thinking a little bit about the future, I think having maybe both of you address sort of this idea of the post-2026 river operations and kind of where we're headed at this point. I feel like you can read a news article about the Colorado River every day. And so trying to really keep up with what's going on is a challenge. And I'm just thinking even, I've more recently kind of learned a little bit about just the shifting politics of Colorado or Arizona versus California. And now sort of, it sounds like this shift between the upper basin and the lower basin. And yeah, just sort of thinking, what is the outlook as we move into what I assume is a fairly important 2026 date? Could you guys just address that in general?
Right. So the operations of Lakes Powell and Mead. they're operated conjunctively, and they're operated under a 20-year agreement that is about to expire. And so, and that's really important. When we say the operation of Lake Powell and Mead, what we really are talking about is the levels at which those reservoirs are held for recreational purposes, for water supply purposes, for hydropower purposes, for all sorts of purposes. And we're talking about the levels at which involuntary shortages will be assessed in the lower basin, primarily against, like I said, the urban corridor of Phoenix and Tucson, but some others as well. So when we talk about the expiration of these operating guidelines, we're talking about the expiration of all the really, really important rules that govern pretty much everything on this river system. So it's a super big deal. And the problem is that there just is no agreement about what those rules are going to look like post 2026. There is agreement in the lower basin that there is what we call structural deficit, meaning that the water uses in the lower basin are oversubscribed, that we're using too much. And there has been some agreement, not total, but some agreement in the lower basin that the lower basin needs to deal with that and cut uses. Beyond that, there is no agreement between the upper basin states of Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado, and the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, and California. And then, of course, Mexico's in the mix, not to mention 30 tribes. So the federal government has been going through a required process under NEPA, the National Environmental Laws, to scope out and do an environmental assessment of what different alternatives for operation might look like. But of course, it's an election season, and no one wants to show their hand right before a major presidential election. So we won't see what that scoping report even looks like until after the election. And I presume, could be wrong, that the federal government will present such a broad array of options that it really won't hint very well at what the federal government might be thinking in terms of post-2026 operations. And I'll stop and see what John has to say about that.
In my academic career, which is not terribly academic because I'm mostly a journalist, I'm at a moment where I really wish I understood game theory better, right? Where you've got complicated negotiation patterns involving different players with different interests. And I mean, Kathryn laid out the challenges really nicely. And the bottom line is that right now, the status of the negotiations is that lots of people are afraid to offer solutions that require them to give up water. All of them have a lawyer that says, well, if we end up in court, we're not going to probably have to give the water and we'll probably win. And, to quote a line that I've used myself in several different things I've written, there's not enough water for all the lawyers to be right. And so we kind of don't know where we're at as a result.
I think that's very much true. And it's interesting. I do think that one of the reasons that up until now, the 7 states, the Republic of Mexico, the tribes, everyone have been able to come together and come up with solutions, is that the lift to date has not been quite so extreme as the lift is now. And by that, I mean, in the past, we had to make some amount of cuts to help the river system, but the level of cuts that we need to make now, because the river basin is aridifying, the level of cuts is just it's so deep that it's really hard to get there. We're talking about needing to cut somewhere between 1.5 million acre feet of water per year to as much as 4 million acre feet of water per year. And to put that in perspective, the entire lower basin is entitled to 7.5 million acre feet of water. So, I mean, it's just such a big amount of water that really creates a huge obstacle to coming forward with solutions.
And when I wrote my book, Waters for Fighting Over, it was it's an optimistic book. It's a book that chronicles the processes of coming together collectively to agree to use less water and to collaboratively share the river. And, I documented how we had done this again and again over time. And I document how communities had successfully used less water and still thrived. And I projected that into the future in that book. I went out on a limb and said, look, I think we can do this. And when the book came out, it was sort of a novelty. Oh my God, someone has written an optimistic book about the Colorado River. What's up with that? And they would invite me to conferences and speak. I was on the speaking circuit at water conferences for the next year. And I would get up there and give my optimistic spiel. And then one of the climate scientists would get up and would offer the sort of dire possibilities. And the dire possibilities were, well, maybe it'll be this bad, meaning some more cuts needed, and maybe it'll be a lot bad. And I would sort of have my head in my hands at that point and think, well, if it's a little bad, what I'm writing about can deal with that. But for the reasons that Kathryn explained, it's a lot worse. And it's not clear that the water sharing mechanisms, the collaborative mechanisms that I wrote about 10 years ago are up to the task that we now face.
Yeah. And for perspective, it's one thing to cut 20% of your water use, right? You can pull from efficiencies. The major cities of the basin, for the most part, have done that. I know in the city of Phoenix, just as an example, per capita water use, has fallen basically 30% over 20 years, right? I know every city in the basin can claim a similar statistic. A lot of the irrigation districts, have done similar things. But when you've done the 20% and then someone turns around and says, okay, now give me 50% more, right? It's just a very different problem. And I think that's where we're at. And that's really difficult to confront.
Yeah, and I think that is difficult because it might be just on the shoulders of a few, or if you spread that load throughout the different stakeholders, I mean, don't get me wrong, it is painful, but you're spreading it out rather than on the few. And going back to John's, like, who is in charge and figuring out the law of the river, and I think I'm really glad that the two of you always talked about the 7 states plus the Republic of Mexico plus 30 tribes, and I think really speaks of the basin-wide approach that you do. So in terms of disenfranchised groups, I'm not sure if it is the First Nations, the tribes, or Mexico, but could you talk about where you see some of the challenges that remain in getting the full participation during the decision-making process by groups that have not been typically included?
So I'll start, and then I know this is something that Kathryn actually, from her perspective in Arizona, has thought a lot about in some really useful ways as well. But I want to start broadly, because I think one of the really important things that has happened in the last 20 or 25 years is the creation of an institutional framework. And by institutions, I mean both the rules, but also the informal norms that have expanded the discussion to include the Republic of Mexico, so that where, there was a period of time in the late 90s and the early 2000s that I wrote about in my book where Mexico was ignored in a way that became extremely problematic, with some actions that we were taking on the U.S. side of the border and the California-Mexico border. But this has happened before, right? Going back to the 50s and 60s with a crisis where we were delivering highly saline water. And we seem to have emerged from that with a structure of both governance, but also informal norms, that it's now expected that as we try to negotiate these changes, the Republic of Mexico will be included. And I feel better about that from my side of the border, looking down at that process. The tribes are a more complicated issue, and we've made enormous progress. And when I say we've made, I think the tribes as sovereigns have insisted on a place at the table. And we now see some really hopeful rhetoric about the need for the tribes to have that place at the table. But we're not seeing that turned into reality in the process yet. And there's constant 2 steps forward, 1 step back as we look at this, in part because of the issues that Kathryn talked about, how hard it is for water users to realize they're going to have to cut even more, because to the extent that we really take seriously our obligation to the tribes, then the existing water users have to cut even more to honor the tribal water rights.
Yeah, it is super complex. There is a lot of focus on this fabled table, right? Who's at the table, who isn't, who's invited, who isn't, where do these meetings take place? And I think that is healthy and productive, but I think it's probably more productive to focus less on the table and more on, okay, but who wields influence? Because those two things are not necessarily the same. They often are, but not exclusively. And case in point, there are tribes that wield enormous influence on the river basin by nature of the seniority and size of their water rights, or by nature of their own tribal governance structure and the actions that they've taken. So it to me, what matters is who is influencing the decision. And I will tell you that the table is so small that even the cities of the Colorado River Basin are, for the most part, not included. There are, major exceptions to that, but particularly in California, I think the cities wield, more power at the table. But that was long a frustration of the city of Phoenix, as an example. So, the 5th largest city in the country, the largest city in Arizona, its state capital, does not have a place at the table. And they are actually the entity providing tap water to 1.7 million people. So let that sink in. But what matters is, okay, are these entities able to wield influence? And there are different ways of doing that, some successful, some not. But I also think it's important to understand that, when you're talking about 30 tribes, all the major cities of the basin, all the major agricultural producers, all the different stakeholders who are all important, right? Every single one of them. If you had a table that held all of them, there would just be too many people. You can't conduct negotiations in that style. So I think by its nature, it's going to be a messy process no matter what. But it is important that we give voices to those who have been disenfranchised in the past, to those, who have not been able to exert the influence.
Thank you for that. And kind of related to this issue of how governance is happening, we've talked quite a bit already about climate change and aridification. And you mentioned the amount of reductions that we need to see, and just their scope is so vast to me to consider. How do we get to those numbers? What's the path? If the path isn't what we thought the path was 10 years ago, what is the path for achieving the reductions in this aridifying climate? Or if you have ideas for what that might end up looking like or what it needs to look like.
I want to start with talking a little bit about the science itself and how the science has been used in policymaking. Eric Kuhn and I wrote a book, Science Be Damned, how ignoring inconvenient science drained the Colorado River, right? And that title, how ignoring inconvenient science, is really important because we documented a process over much of a century of people making political decisions that were made easier when they ignored the science that said there would be less water. And they were able to do it because the basin was still developing and we had not yet maxed out our ability to use the water. So they got away with it over and over again, just kicking the can down the road. Sometime around the late 90s or early 2000s, the hydrologic reality collided with the fact that we finally had developed all the dams and canals and pumping stations to begin really using all the water that was allocated over the previous century's rules. And the reality began sinking in the early 2000s. And one of the important things is that I think now the people in charge of the basin are doing a much better job of taking the science seriously. And I think that's one of the reasons that the political decisions are so much harder. It would be easy for us to pretend, yeah, it'll get wetter again. Let's just not worry about this. We're not doing that, which is good. And the decisions are really, really hard as a result.
I agree 100% with that. And taking a step back, there's really only two things that you can do to get to the numbers that we need to get to. And that's voluntary cuts that usually mean someone gets paid to not use water. That is a mechanism that we deploy at scale right now. A lot of the drought contingency plan, which was put into place in 2019, when John got that text as he was riding his bike and it looked like things were going downhill really fast. A lot of the mechanisms that we put in place in the drought contingency plan are just that. Like, let me just, pay you to use less water. And that's great because there are actually people who are willing to be paid not to use water, tribes, agricultural districts, cities, others. So that's wonderful. But the problem is, of course, money is not always plentiful. And so it's uncertain. The other path that you can take are involuntary cuts. And you can imagine how politically painful involuntary cuts are. To date, Arizona, of course, has taken the vast majority of the involuntary cuts because of that infamous year, 1968, and our, Central Arizona's lower priority on the system. What that might look like post 2026, I think, is really up for grabs. But that is a major issue. All the other states and the Republic of Mexico, I get it. They love to point their fingers and say, well, sorry, Central Arizona, you took that deal in 1968. You have the lowest priority. It's all on you. But that means cutting off water to the tribes in Central Arizona that rely on that water. And like I mentioned, to the nation's, fifth largest city and to some other, very important uses. And so it's easy to fall back on that thinking. I think implementing it in reality is going to be a very different thing. So where this combination of voluntary and involuntary cuts comes from, I don't know, but that's how you got to get there. There really is not another alternative.
Following on that, these are incredible challenges to surpass. A lot of this all of a sudden becomes a conversation of not only water and water amounts, but also values, moral values on those. I don't know. I'll always think that water is not an individual property; it's a shared resource, and that one opened the doors of what you are mentioning, Kathryn. Like, why should we only have the burden of the short end of the stick, not having water or distributing it? So I don't know. I think here definitely we're not short of challenges, but what are some of the biggest challenges that you see in the Colorado River? And going back to John's optimism, where do you see the possibilities? Where do you see where we can make some good progress?
Okay, John is being really quiet. That's because this is hard. I'm optimistic because you have a group of people who care so deeply about this river system and not just for its uses for growing crops or delivering drinking water to cities or to environmental uses, but as a flowing, living thing. I think that is a shared value among all the stakeholders of the basin. So that gives me optimism. And I think everyone has the best of intentions. I think money solves a lot of problems, but then we got to figure out how to make sure the money is secure and there when we need it.
So, Tim, you're right. This is a question of values. And so, there's no a priori way to argue for the correct set of values. But I think it's really important for me to state mine. And my goal, my moral and ethical guiding principle as I think about the governance of the Colorado River that I try to argue for and influence is a belief that every single community within the Colorado River Basin is of value and has a right to continue to exist. That's my personal set of values, because a lot of the argument is turning now, as people get madder at one another, into an us versus them kind of argument, and people trying to stake out a legal position where the other people have to make all the cuts. We share this space, 7 states in the United States, 2 in Mexico. We all are here now. I believe it is possible to approach the task of responding to the reality of climate change and adapting to climate change in a way that shares the burden across communities, because I believe that every single community in this basin can continue to exist and can continue to thrive with less water than it's now using. I would prefer that my community of Albuquerque be as green as it can be, right? Because that's what we're using the water for, is to be green, whether it's the pastures, whether it's the alfalfa fields down in the valley, whether it's the trees in my neighborhood. There will be less green stuff all over across the Colorado River Basin. But if we manage it mindfully and collaboratively, everybody can kind of scale back and approach the adaptation to climate change collectively. And this sounds really Pollyanna-ish, and I often don't see how we get from here to there, but that is my value and that is my goal. And I believe we can still do this.
I do too. And I think that was well said.
So we always like to ask our guests if there's anything more that you would like people and our listeners to know about your work and how we can support your efforts.
So I'll start because I think this is a really wonderful question. A version of this question is often what I turn to when I'm giving talks, when I'm speaking publicly. And that is to ask 2 things of the people who are listening to this, who are part of the Colorado River Basin communities as users of water. One is to not be afraid, because when we're afraid of that future, it creates this limbic response and we become defensive, and it contributes to conflict and cuts off the avenues for collaboration that we will need. And then this relates to a sort of political ask of people. I would ask you to have the grace and generosity to your local political leaders to give them permission to bargain away some of your water, because if you demand that they defend your water, all hell's going to break loose.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I would say that it's really important that the public ask questions and be engaged. It's hard, this day and age, there's so many things to distract. It's hard to pay attention to water, but it is so critically important to every community. And it's so important that people just ask questions of their elected officials and be part of the conversation.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. I feel like I could ask you 400 more questions, but we're going to have to leave it at this for now. But thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Water Talk podcast. I'm Faith Kearns, and I'm the Director of Research Communications with the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative at Arizona State University.
My name is Samuel Sandoval. I'm a professor at UC Davis and a cooperative extension specialist in water resources management at the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
I'm Molly Kanoko, Assistant Professor and State Extension Specialist in Agricultural Water Management at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you enjoy our show, please review, listen, like, and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. Please find transcripts and additional content at watertalkpodcast.com. Original music by Paloma Herrera Thomas.